Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 411 for the 14th of Teves in a regular year. Today's episode has been generously sponsored by Julie Schechter in the merit of a refuah shlema for Henya Bas Bracha Dvora Leah Fetterman. Thank you so much, Julie, for sponsoring the podcast, and for other sponsorship opportunities, please visit itistaught.com. Thank you so much. These sponsorships really encourage me to continue with this, and there are quite a bit of expenses that go into this podcast, so it is definitely very helpful getting these sponsorships in. So thank you so much again. Moving on to today's Tanya. So I want to talk a little bit about something which I had mentioned already in the podcast, this idea, which is very prevalent in modern culture, of being authentic, being true to yourself, being real, and everything like that, and what that means exactly. We spoke about the song in the popular movie The Greatest Showman called This Is Me, where people are just celebrating their eccentricities, celebrating who they are, like unabashedly, this is who I am. We live in a culture where shame is like the worst sin in the world, that, God forbid somebody should feel a sense of shame for being overweight, feeling a sense of shame for having certain desires, certain impulses. And not only should they not feel a sense of shame, but if this is how you're feeling on the inside, then if you were to behave differently on the outside, that would actually be hypocritical of you. And then we'd be walking around and we'd be surrounded by a bunch of hypocrites. How do we know what to really believe? This person is acting like they're a nice person, but perhaps on the inside, they actually really hate me. Perhaps they're not as nice as they appear on the outside at all. Shouldn't they be authentic? Shouldn't they just show the world who they really are? If they have these negative emotions, let the world see who you truly are. Don't pretend, don't go through life feeling this sense of imposter syndrome. So that's sort of like the modern prevailing philosophy, is this idea that the true self is our feelings, the true self is our inner world, and we want to make sure that the outer self reflects this inner self as much as possible. Otherwise, we're really not being authentic. Otherwise, we're not being real. So today we're going to see what the Tanya has to say about this, and how the Tanya actually takes a very different approach to this whole notion of the authentic self and the true self and what that means. And as we've already explained, as we've already explored, when we talk about the authentic self, quote unquote, the true self, the internal self, it's actually not so simple, because at least when it comes to a Jewish person actually has two internal selves, two souls that are constantly at war, constantly battling with one another. We have the godly soul and we have the animal soul. And their motivations, their impulses, their instincts are actually totally contradictory and totally at odds with one another. So when we say act like your true self, first of all, what does this mean? Which true self are we talking about? Are we talking about our animal self, or are we talking about our godly self? Now, perhaps one could argue that, well, it depends whichever self is in control. Because if we're talking about the fact that these souls are at constant war with one another, then perhaps it's a matter of, okay, if these souls are at war with one another, whichever soul is winning at the time, whichever soul is in full reign, that is your true self in the moment, and that's the true self you should show to the world. So if, for example, you come home after a long day of work and there's a big box of donuts sitting on your table for whatever reason. Somehow they got there. Whenever I give this example, people are like, oh, I wish I came home and there was a big box of donuts sitting on my table. That would be nice. Like, who brought them there? But let's just say, for sake of argument, you have a big box of donuts that you bought for a party or something like that, and they're sitting on your table, and you're starving. And your initial instinct is to eat those donuts. That's yourself. That's what your inside is telling you. Your animal soul is raging at that moment. It's like, I really want to eat those donuts. Versus your godly soul very quietly in the background is like, maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe instead, I should make a healthy dinner for myself that's going to give me a little bit more energy so I can concentrate and have better focus when I pray to God, when I think about God, when I learn, when I go about my day. So if we were to go in line with this whole like authentic living kind of thing, then, wouldn't the real sense of authentic living be to eat the donuts? That's what your soul, quote unquote, in the moment is telling you to do, right? Another example would be, let's say you're at a party and you see someone at the party who is a little bit of a nebuch case, and doesn't really have a lot of friends, and nobody is really talking to them. And the truth is, you don't really want to talk to them either, because they're not a very interesting person to talk to. But they clearly are needing someone to talk to. They are needed of a friend. They actually come up to you. They start talking to you. What do? Well, your instinct is to move away from them or to tell them that they're annoying or something like that, right? There's actually a whole movement surrounding this called radical honesty, which was started by some guy named Brad Blanton, who would say that this is exactly what you should do, that you should actually say to them, listen, I really don't want to talk to you. I find you quite annoying. He would actually say that you should do that this is what you should do. So indeed, you can think to yourself, why not? If life is really all about being true to yourself and true and authentic, and that at that moment, your animal soul is ruling over you, and that's what's screaming out, then shouldn't your actions display that? Shouldn't your actions represent who you truly are, instead of being a faker, instead of like being all nice on the outside when really on the inside you just want to get out of there and you don't want to be in that conversation? Shouldn't you just go ahead and eat that box of donuts instead of making a nice healthy meal for yourself, but then the whole time thinking to yourself like, I really wish I was eating donuts right now. So what's the deal? So what we're going to discuss today, and we've already brought up this idea, is the soul actually is quite a complex thing. We already know that we have these two souls that are at war with one another. There's the animal soul, and then there's the godly soul that are constantly battling for space and for rulership over the body. But what we also know is that each one of these souls actually has different garments that's associated with it. The garments are called the same thing. They're called the garments of thought, speech, and action. But the garments of the godly soul appear very different and are composed of very different things than the garments of the animal soul. Now, the other thing that we want to keep in mind is something that we had learned previously in the Tanya, if you recall this, that as much as the animal soul and the godly soul are at war in terms of their core motivations and their impulses, ultimately, the animal soul wants you to overcome it. The animal soul wants you to resist its urges. It's there to test you. It's there to challenge you. But it actually doesn't deep down want you to indulge, want you to give in. So when we keep both of these things in mind, what we can come to realize is that not only should we not give into our animal soul, even if the animal soul is raging, even if the animal soul is on the inside really gaining like very high level of control over our feelings and our instincts, we can still resist it by putting on the clothing of the godly soul. So yes, maybe we are being a fake on a certain level, quote unquote, but we're actually not, because it's okay to wear garments of the godly soul, even if your internal soul attributes haven't quite caught up yet. And this state of being, of wearing garments of the godly soul, even if your insides are not fully aligned, is what it means to be a Beinoni, to be an intermediate person, which is what this book is really all about. This is what the book is catered to. The Sefer Tanya is written, it's called the Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book of the Beinoni. It's all about how to achieve this level of wearing garments of the godly soul, even if your insides are not totally aligned. So when we recognize this, there's actually something very comforting about this, very light about this. There's like a load that's lifted off. Is that what the Alter Rebbe is basically telling us is that we don't have to change our insides. We don't have to get to the point of becoming repulsed by donuts or not even being tempted by donuts or loving every single person at the party and naturally wanting to talk to everybody and all of that kind of stuff. That's okay if our insides don't feel that way. But our behavior, we should still strive to have our behavior be in line. And in fact, something that we'll learn today is that when a person is living in this kind of state of existence where their behavior is correct, they're wearing the garments of the godly soul, even if their insides aren't totally aligned, there are certain auspicious times when their godly soul actually can rule in a more internal way, where they can get a sense of love of God in a very strong way, which is something that usually a tzaddik can only have access to. But there are times that a Beinoni can have this as well, namely during prayer or during saying the Shema, the Krias Shema, which are times, auspicious times to arouse this sense of love of God. But the difference between a Beinoni and a tzaddik is that for a Beinoni, these emotions, these sensations don't last. After the person has stopped praying, they're back to the war, they're back to the battle. Versus in the case of a tzaddik, these emotions do last. They don't need to be praying in order to feel this way. So with all of this being said, let's see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. And for context, we are beginning a new chapter today. It's chapter 12 of Likkutei Amarim. And if you've been following along the past few episodes, and please go back and review if you haven't already, we've already spoken about these two other categories, which are further subdivided into two subcategories each, namely the category of the tzaddik and the category of the rasha, the category of the righteous person and the category of the wicked person, and what those entail. So I'm not going to review all of that now. You can go back and listen to previous episodes to get the context for that. But today we're focusing on this other category, this category of the Beinoni, the category of the intermediate man. And this category of the intermediate person is somebody who the negativity within them never dominates over the small city. What's the small city? The small city is a reference to the body, as we spoke about. Remember that there's this battle of the two kings that's trying to rule over the city. So that's the two souls that are trying to rule over the body. So for a Beinoni, the negativity never dominates over the body to the point that it brings the body to sin. So what this means in a more technical level is it never gets to the point that the garments, the levushim of the animal soul, which are thought, speech, and action that come from the side of klipa, never gain full rulership over the person to bring the person into a state of sin. And instead, what does rule over the person is the garments of the godly soul. And they're the only ones that are actually like activating the body, that are making the body, like whenever the person is, in plain English, whenever the person is thinking or speaking or acting, they're thinking or speaking or acting in a godly manner. And they never sin, ever. Like their whole life, they never sin. So we can never call them a rasha, even for a moment. Because if you recall, a rasha is somebody who even sins temporarily. Even if a person does one sin and then then they do tshuva and then they're back and they're good. That moment that they were doing a sin, they're considered to be a rasha. So a Beinoni cannot be somebody who ever sins. So keeping this in mind, if we're saying that the person's all their thoughts, all their speech, and all of their action is only and solely directed towards serving God, why is this person not a tzaddik? It seems like a pretty high level, right? So this is because when we're talking about the dominance that the godly soul has over the animal soul in a Beinoni, we're talking about their garments, their soul garments, their thought, speech, and action, the external behaviors that they display. But when it comes to their insides, when it comes to the 10 aspects of the godly soul, they don't have soul rulership over the small city, at least not at all times. So sometimes they do, like during Krias Shema, as we mentioned. So when the person is saying Shema or when a person's praying, these are considered to be times of what's called mochin de gadlut, supernal intellect. So this is a time when there's like a great illumination in the higher worlds, which manifests as being a very auspicious time down here for us to pray and to connect to God. And at that time, because it's the mochin de gadlut, it's this supernal intellect state, then this is a time when a person has the ability to connect their chokhmah, bina, and das, their three intellectual faculties of the soul, these are the first primary faculties of the soul, to connect them to God and to really deepen their das, deepen their attachment to the greatness of God, to arouse a great feeling of love of God within them, a great love that's considered like a burning love in the right ventricle of their heart, to connect with God, to cleave to God with Torah and mitzvahs out of love. Which is, why is this connect? Why does this happen during Krias Shema and during prayer? Because this is what Krias Shema, if you read the Krias Shema, the words of the Shema, which come from the Torah, as well as the blessings of the Shema that come before it and that come after it, which are rabbinical in origin and which serve the purpose of preparing a person to actually read the Shema. These all have to do with arousing a sense of love of God. So during these auspicious times, when a person is connected to God while they're saying Shema and they're arousing this and they're praying and they're arousing this love in the right ventricle of the heart, then the negativity that's found in the left ventricle of the heart becomes subdued and becomes nullified to the good. And the good kind of overpowers it and it spreads out from the right ventricle of the heart, from the chokhmah, bina, das, from the three intellectual faculties, and connect with God. So during that time, basically the Beinoni can have this experience that's similar to a tzaddik who lives in this state at all times, at all moments, where, as we described, their love of God, which is found in the right ventricle of the heart, pours over and subdues the negativity in the left ventricle of the heart. But the only difference is here now, when it comes to the Beinoni, after prayer, then the mochin de gadlus, the supernal intellect, leaves, and it's not in this state of illumination anymore. Then the negativity comes back and it becomes once again aroused in the left ventricle of the heart, and the person once again feels these desires to be in the physical world and lusts after the desires of the physical world. So that's the end of the section for today. And so just to bring it all together, once again, the basic difference between a Beinoni and between a tzaddik and a rasha is that for a Beinoni, there's like this interesting like contradiction, seeming contradiction going on. On the one hand, they're behaving properly. When it comes to the garments of the soul, the thought, speech, and action of the soul, the godly soul has gained full rulership. They are only wearing godly garments of thought, speech, and action. Their thoughts are only about God, their speech is only about God, and their actions only have to do with God. However, when it comes to their insights, when it comes to their inner attributes, which have to do with their impulses and their emotions and their feelings, there is still a war, and the godly soul has not gained full ownership over them, which means that they're still battling. They still have the same cravings that you and I do. They still, desire things that are not 100% for God, and kind of have these desires that are in line with their baser instincts. They're just able to conquer these things when it comes to their thought, speech, and action. There are times, however, as we learned today, that even the Beinoni can tap into this state where their insides do align with their outsides, where they do feel this intense love for God. And this is namely during Krias Shema and prayer. Why? Because during Krias Shema and prayer, then there's an arousal that happens. There's an illumination that happens supernally, an illumination of the supernal mochin. What this means really, it's hard to totally grasp and picture, but just to know that there is some type of illumination that happens. And the way that translates to us is it creates this auspicious time for us to connect to God through our intellects. And the intellects are the primary and foremost attributes of the soul. So during those times, the Beinoni actually does have this potential to connect to God in a more internal way. The only difference is that after the prayer is finished, then that sensation goes away and they're back to battling with their baser instincts and not living with a consciousness and a conscious kind of love of God. That's like this feeling of passionate love of God. They act correctly, but their heart and their insides don't necessarily align with their actions. So that's it for today. And we will continue tomorrow when we continue to explore this chapter 12, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.